It was late summer, and the city breathed with that heavy mix of heat and exhaust, the kind that clung to skin and made tempers run short. The streets of downtown were restless, a tide of cars and people weaving through traffic lights and crosswalks, each carrying their own stories, their own burdens. Neon signs flickered outside corner stores, and the sound of sirens cut through the night every so often, sharp reminders that even in moments of stillness, the city was never truly calm. Beneath the surface of everyday life, tension sat quietly, waiting to break. On the west side of town, patrol cars moved in and out of the streets, headlights sweeping across cracked sidewalks and graffiti-tagged walls. Officers leaned against their vehicles outside small diners, laughing in short bursts. But the laughter always had an edge to it. There was a culture there, unspoken rules that went deeper than any handbook, where respect was demanded but rarely given, and where authority was sometimes twisted into a weapon. To the people who lived in those neighborhoods, the sight of a police cruiser didn't always bring safety. More often, it carried the weight of fear. Among those officers was one man who had grown comfortable with that weight. He had been on the force for years, long enough to believe that his badge gave him more than power. It gave him dominance. He thrived on control, on bending people under the weight of his authority, especially those he already looked down on. He wore his uniform like armor, but under it was a man shaped by bitterness and prejudice, someone who carried his own personal anger into every stop he made. His presence on the streets wasn't just law enforcement, it was intimidation. On the other side of the city, life moved in quieter rhythms. The man who would soon collide with this officer lived a world away from those grimy corners, though not in distance, but in purpose. His morning started early, with black coffee and an endless stream of reports piled across his desk. His work wasn't about showing power on the streets. It was about accountability, about making sure those who wore the badge didn't misuse it. He was respected by some, feared by others, and quietly resented by many who saw his role as a threat. His job required patience, a sharp eye for detail, and the kind of calm that didn't waver when others tried to shake it. Outside his office, he was a man of quiet discipline. He didn't move loudly through the world, but there was a confidence about him, a steadiness that didn't need to announce itself. He was careful in the way he spoke, deliberate in the choices he made, and to those who worked with him closely, it was clear he was not someone who could be easily manipulated. His life was not without its own sacrifices, long hours, strained relationships, but he carried those costs as part of the burden of his position. The city held both men, but they moved in separate circles, their paths never crossing, until one evening when circumstance would force them into direct collision. One lived in the comfort of unchecked arrogance, the other in the quiet authority of oversight. Neither knew that within a single moment, one traffic stop would strip away those layers and expose everything beneath. The night it happened, the streets were lit by the dim glow of street lamps, their light barely cutting through the shadows. Stores were closing up, their metal gates rattling down over glass doors. The steady hum of engines filled the air as cars rolled down wide avenues and narrow side streets. People hurried home, tired from the day, while others lingered outside bars, laughing too loudly in the dark. It felt like an ordinary night in a city used to its own chaos. But the ordinary has a way of hiding the cracks. The officer was restless behind the wheel of his patrol car, his hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. He scanned every vehicle that passed, as if each one carried an offense waiting to be punished. His mind wasn't on safety or service. It was on control. It was about reminding people who really had the power in these streets. He had done it before, stopped men who looked a certain way, questioned them, humiliated them, just to feed the part of him that demanded to feel superior. At the same time, a black sedan moved steadily through the traffic, its driver calm, not in a rush, just another man trying to get home after a long day. There was nothing about the car that stood out, nothing reckless about its speed or movement. To any ordinary eye, It was invisible in the sea of vehicles that crowded the road, but to the officer it became something else, an opportunity. In the quiet moments before the siren lit up the street, everything seemed normal. But the truth was, both men carried with them invisible histories, invisible battles. One carried the arrogance of unchecked authority, the other the quiet strength of a man tasked with keeping that authority honest. The world didn't yet know it, but when they met on that dark street, masks would slip, power would be tested, and nothing about that ordinary night would remain ordinary. The city has a way of hiding its truths until it can't anymore. And as the patrol car pulled closer to the black sedan, flashing its lights and demanding it stop, a chain of events was set into motion that would not only change the lives of the two men inside those vehicles, but would send shockwaves through an entire department. The balance between justice and abuse, dignity and humiliation, was about to be exposed under the harsh glare of flashing lights. The siren pierced the night, a shrill command that demanded obedience. The Black Sea saw. Eden slowed, pulling over toward the curb with calm precision, its driver careful in his movements. Inside the patrol car, the officer's pulse quickened, not from duty but from something darker, an old hunger to dominate, to remind someone of their place. He stepped out, boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud, the sound echoing off the quiet street. Every part of him radiated authority, but it wasn't the kind born of responsibility. It was the kind born of superiority. The driver rolled his window down halfway, his face steady, his eyes watchful. He didn't argue. He didn't move too quickly. He knew the rules of these moments, the unspoken dangers of even the smallest action. But behind his calm expression was something else. Disappointment. He had seen men like this before. Men who wore the uniform as if it were a crown. Men who used it not to protect, but to degrade. He had made a career out of holding them accountable. But here he was, pulled into the same theater he had tried so long to dismantle. The officer leaned down, his tone sharp and clipped. "License and registration." The words were flat, but the undertone was clear. "You're under me, and I'm going to remind you of it." The driver handed them over without a word, his eyes steady, his silence its own form of defiance. It was a silence that irritated the officer more than insults ever could. Silence suggested strength. It suggested a man who wasn't afraid. This small exchange was the spark. On the surface, it was just another stop, routine and unremarkable. But beneath it, tension coiled tighter with every second. The officer wanted to provoke. The driver refused to bend. Neither man would back down, though neither yet knew just how far the other was willing to go. The city around them hummed on, unaware of the storm building in that quiet corner. But storms aren't born from one cloud alone. They gather from layers of heat, pressure, and history, and both men carried their own storms inside. The officer's storm began years earlier. He had grown up in a house where anger was passed down like a family heirloom. His father had worked in a factory, worn down by years of labor and bitterness, quick to lash out when the world made him feel small. From him, the officer learned early that control was survival, that domination meant respect. When he joined the police force, he found a place where that lesson could be sharpened, where his anger could be masked as authority. The streets became his stage, and the people who looked like they didn't belong became his targets. Over time, what started as small abuses of power grew into habit, then into instinct. The driver's storm was quieter, but no less real. In his position, he had seen the worst of the force. Corruption buried under reports, brutality dismissed as necessary force, complaints lost in paperwork. He had spent years peeling back those layers, exposing the rot beneath. Each case he worked on chipped away at him, Not because he doubted his mission, but because he carried the weight of every victim who never saw justice. His role demanded patience and restraint, but even restraint builds pressure over time. And tonight, face to face with one of the very types of officers he had fought to hold accountable, that pressure swelled. The officer took his time at the car window, circling questions that had nothing to do with traffic laws. "Where are you headed?" His tone wasn't curiosity. It was a challenge. "What's in the trunk?" The questions grew sharper, layered with implication. The driver answered plainly, refusing to show the irritation pressing against his chest. He knew better than to give the man fuel. But the more he remained calm, the more the officer burned with frustration. External pressures only added fuel to the fire. The department had been under public scrutiny lately. Stories of misconduct whispered through the press, lawsuits filed by families who claimed their loved ones were mistreated. Officers felt the heat, and many responded with hostility, seeing every critique as an attack. For men like this officer, that pressure hardened his resentment. Every stop became a chance to push back, to prove he still had control over someone. The driver, too, carried external weight. His position was not just a job, but a responsibility that stretched into every part of his life. He couldn't afford mistakes. Not on the street, not in his reports, not in his personal conduct. He lived in a world where one wrong move could be twisted against him, used to undermine everything he had built. And so he lived carefully, deliberately, always aware of how thin the line was between respect and ruin. But even the most careful man can be pushed, and this night was pushing him. As the officer took the documents back to his patrol car, he lingered, flipping through them slower than necessary, a smirk ghosting across his face. He was searching for something, anything, that would justify what he wanted to do next. He didn't care about minor violations. He wanted control. And when he returned to the window, he leaned in closer, invading the man's space in a way that was both subtle and unmistakably hostile. "You people think you can do whatever you want," he muttered, low but deliberate. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. The driver's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. It wasn't the first time he had heard such venom, but it never lost its sting. Still, he refused to give the man the satisfaction of a reaction. That silence again was a weapon, and the officer hated it. As the exchange dragged on, the driver's mind began to shift. He wasn't just a man pulled over anymore. He was a man standing in the middle of everything he had spent his career fighting against. It wasn't about a broken taillight or a missed signal. It was about power wielded without accountability. And the realization settled into him like a stone. This wasn't just an unpleasant stop. This was proof. Proof of the rot he knew lived inside the system. Proof that would soon become undeniable. For the officer, the internal struggle was different. Deep down, some part of him knew he was walking a thin line, but the years had numbed him to consequences. No one had ever truly challenged him, and he had grown bold in that immunity. But tonight felt different. This man's calm unsettled him. It chipped at the foundation of control he had built for so long. It made him reckless, desperate to re-establish the dominance he felt slipping through his fingers. The air between them thickened with every passing second. The driver's patience was stretched thin, his mind flickering through choices: comply, endure, or confront. The officer's temper tightened, his own choices narrowing: push harder, escalate, or back down. Neither man could see beyond the moment, but both felt it. A breaking point was near. The street around them was quiet, but the silence only amplified the tension. Each word, each pause, each glance became louder in the stillness. And in that silence, the ground shifted. It was no longer just a stop. It was a confrontation between two men carrying years of history, resentment, and duty on their shoulders. The driver straightened in his seat, his calm no longer just restraint, but something sharper, something rooted in authority. He looked directly at the officer, not with fear, but with a steady gaze that cut through the man's bravado. It was the kind of look that said, without words, "I see you for what you are." And in that moment, the officer felt something he wasn't used to feeling on these streets, the edge of losing control. This was only the beginning. The real storm had yet to break, but already the ground was trembling. Both men were locked in a silent battle, each fueled by forces larger than themselves: history, prejudice, duty, accountability. And though the world around them still looked ordinary, a line had been drawn, and once crossed, there would be no return. The flashing lights kept pulsing against the walls of the narrow street, a rhythm that made the driver's calm feel more like defiance in the officer's eyes. Each second stretched, thick and uncomfortable, neither man willing to give the other what he wanted. For the officer, this was no longer about a broken traffic law, if there had even been one at all. It was about proving something. He had spotted a man he believed he could put in his place, and now he was locked into the need to follow through. For the driver, this was something different. He had seen men like this before, but never so directly in his own personal space. And though he held himself steady, his patience was being tested in ways he hadn't expected when he first set out that night. The officer circled back to his patrol car, pretending to run checks on the documents he already knew were clean. He sat there, the radio crackling in the background, eyes fixed on the name on the license. He repeated it in his head, trying to place it, to dig at why it bothered him. Something about the man's stillness, his confidence, unsettled him. He wasn't used to being met with silence, much less with composure that felt heavier than aggression. His own thoughts turned bitter. He thinks he's better than me. The idea rooted deep and began to grow. When he returned, his words were sharper, more pointed. "You've been driving a little too comfortably tonight. You think these rules don't apply to you?" The driver met his gaze, calm but unflinching. "I follow the rules. Always." It wasn't just an answer. It was a quiet assertion of integrity, a subtle reminder that respect for the law wasn't owned by the uniform alone. That answer, so steady, gnawed at the officer more than open resistance ever could. He felt mocked, though nothing in the driver's tone carried mockery. These small moments, tiny as they seemed, were where tension thickened. Each word, each silence, was another stone stacked on the growing weight between them. The driver knew how men like this worked, baiting, pushing, waiting for a crack. But he also knew that every calm response he gave only deepened the man's frustration. It was a trap with no safe exit. Answer too strongly, and you risk escalation. Stay too calm, and the anger builds in silence. Outside, forces added fuel in unseen ways. The officers' department had been under investigation recently, a cloud hanging over every shift. Rumors swirled about higher-ups watching closely, whispers that discipline was coming for those who drew too much attention. For officers like him, already nursing grudges and insecurities, that scrutiny burned like a spotlight. He felt the world turning against him, and every encounter became a chance to claw back a sense of control. Stopping this driver wasn't just about the man in front of him. It was about fighting the shadow of accountability he felt pressing down from above. The driver lived under his own kind of pressure. His work made him both respected and resented, sometimes by the same people. He had allies, yes, but he also had enemies who watched him with cold eyes, waiting for the day he slipped. He carried that awareness constantly, knowing every action will be twisted, every misstep magnified. Even now, sitting in the dim glow of flashing lights, he thought about what this could mean if it went wrong, what headlines would say, what enemies in the department would whisper behind closed doors. He couldn't afford anger, couldn't afford pride, but restraint was its own prison. It meant swallowing insult after insult until they stacked like bricks on his chest. The officer leaned further into provocation, asking questions he had no right to ask. Where was he coming from? Where was he going? Did he have drugs? Weapons? The words were a performance, a play the officer had staged many times, one where he controlled every move. But tonight, the script wasn't unfolding the way he wanted. His audience wasn't trembling or fumbling with excuses. The driver's steady responses left no cracks to wedge into, no chaos to exploit. That steadiness began to feel like mockery, though it was nothing of the sort. Underneath the surface, past grievances were alive. The officer carried years of bitterness toward men who reminded him of his own failures, men who looked confident, educated, untouchable in ways he had never been. He resented them not only for who they were, but for how they reminded him of what he wasn't. This driver, sitting calm and composed, was the embodiment of everything he had long hated. Dignity he couldn't strip away. The driver, in turn, carried his own weight of history. Years of watching men like this officer abuse the badge. Years of reading reports that told the same story over and over. And now that story wasn't just words on paper. It was staring at him through the window of his own car. Inside both men, darker sides were rising. The officer's anger turned inward before spilling out. He thought about the whispers in his precinct, the suspicion that he wasn't as respected as he wanted to be. This stop became his chance to reclaim power, to show he wasn't just another uniform fading into irrelevance. The driver's inner storm was quieter, but it pressed harder with each insult. He thought about the countless people who hadn't been able to defend themselves, who hadn't had his patience or his position. He thought about how many of their voices had been silenced, and for the first time in years, he felt his restraint tremble. The night stretched on, each interaction pulling them closer to the edge. A passerby slowed, glancing at the scene, then hurried off. The officer noticed and felt a flare of paranoia. What if this gets out? That thought twisted his anger into something harsher. He ordered the driver out of the car. The demand wasn't necessary, but it was his way of regaining ground. The driver hesitated only a moment, then complied, stepping into the glow of the headlights. On the street, standing face to face, the tension doubled. Without the barrier of glass, their standoff was raw, stripped bare. The officer tried to tower, to use his presence like a weapon. The driver stood calm, but inside, his pulse thudded heavily. They were locked in a silent struggle that neither could win without breaking something vital. The driver's authority, though unspoken, was beginning to show through in his posture, his unflinching eye contact. And the officer felt it, felt his grip on dominance slipping further. The confrontation became more than just a stop. It was personal now, both men representing forces larger than themselves. The officer was the face of unchecked authority, desperate to maintain control. The driver was the quiet embodiment of accountability, standing firm against intimidation. Every second was a tightening coil, every word a spark waiting to land. What neither man fully grasped in that moment was that the breaking point wasn't somewhere far ahead. It was already there, sitting between them in the charged silence of that street. And once it broke, the world around them would never look the same again. The street was washed in the sharp glare of headlights, the red and blue lights spinning against brick walls like a warning no one could escape. The night was quiet, except for the hum of engines and the clipped orders of the officer. But beneath that quiet was a pressure so thick it was almost visible. The driver stood outside his car, steady but tense, the weight of the moment pressing down on both men. Each second that passed tightened the coil between them, and it was only a matter of time before it snapped. The officer circled him like a predator, asking questions that weren't questions at all, just commands disguised as curiosity. "Empty your pockets. Spread your arms. What are you hiding?" His tone carried accusation, even though the man had done nothing wrong. The driver followed instructions carefully, knowing the danger of even the smallest movement, but his patience was cracking. His silence, his calm, had been his shield all night. But inside he felt the burn of humiliation. He wasn't just a man being stopped anymore. He was a symbol being diminished, dignity stripped away by a man who thought the badge gave him the right. The officer's pulse was pounding. Every second he failed to break the man, he felt like a blow to his ego. He wanted to see fear. He wanted to see submission. But what stared back at him was steady, unshaken. That calm had become unbearable, a mirror reflecting everything the officer hated about himself. And in that mirror, rage took root. "Get on the ground," the officer barked suddenly, voice raised, sharp enough to cut the night. It wasn't a procedure. It wasn't justified. It was raw anger, desperation dressed as authority. The driver froze, his chest tightening. He knew the risk. Refusing could mean escalation, but obeying meant surrendering to humiliation he couldn't justify. The choice tore at him in the space of a heartbeat. His jaw tightened. "No," he said, low but clear. That single word broke everything. The officer's face twisted, red with fury. His hand shot to his belt, fingers curling around the grip of his weapon. The driver's eyes widened, not with fear, but with a grim recognition. He had seen this moment in countless reports, read the last words of men who hadn't walked away. His body went rigid, breath caught in his chest as the world slowed to a sickening crawl. The weapon cleared the holster, the metallic click echoing in the silence. The street seemed to hold its breath. For the officer, time blurred. His mind wasn't on duty anymore. It was on pride, on rage, on the need to end this challenge that had stripped him of control. For the driver, every second was crystal clear. The harsh light on the pavement, the cool night air against his skin, the terrifying closeness of mortality. The shot rang out, deafening in the still night. The sound ricocheted off buildings, a brutal crack that split the silence into chaos. The driver stumbled back, the force tearing through him, pain searing white-hot. He gasped, the world tilting, headlights blurring as his knees buckled. He hit the ground hard, the concrete cold against his palms. His breath came shallow, ragged, the metallic taste of blood rising in his mouth. The officer stood frozen for a moment, the gun still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. His chest heaved, adrenaline pounding so hard he couldn't think. He had wanted control, but what lay before him wasn't control. It was ruin. The man on the ground wasn't just another stop. He was someone more, someone the officer couldn't yet piece together, and dread began to claw its way through the haze of anger. The driver's thoughts flickered like dying sparks. Memories, faces of people he had fought for, voices of those who had trusted him, the weight of the responsibility he carried. Anger surged through the pain, not at death itself, but at the bitter irony of it all. A life spent fighting for accountability, ended by the very abuse he had tried to stop. His eyes burned, not with tears, but with the unbearable clarity of injustice. The immediate aftermath was chaos, wrapped in silence. The officer's hands shook as he lowered the weapon, the reality of what he had done bleeding through the cracks of his anger. He looked around wildly, the empty street suddenly too exposed, every shadow a witness. His mind spun with excuses, rationalizations, a desperate scramble for a story that could cover what had just happened. "He resisted," he whispered under his breath, as if saying it aloud would make it true. He reached for something. He resisted. But the words rang hollow against the sight of the man crumpled on the ground. The driver tried to speak, his lips parting, but the words barely made it past his throat. His strength was fading fast, every breath shallower than the last. But his eyes held steady, burning into the officer, carrying with them a final, silent accusation. "You know what you've done." The weight of those eyes crushed the officer more than the shot itself. He turned, pacing in short, frantic strides, his brain clawing for escape routes. Call it in? Say nothing? Stage the scene? His training screamed at him to follow procedure, but his fear screamed louder. He was no longer an officer upholding law. He was a man standing in the ruins of his own choices. The street smelled of smoke and iron, the blood spreading dark against the pale concrete. Time seemed fractured. Seconds dragged, yet everything was moving too fast. The officer bent down, not out of compassion, but panic. "Stay with me," he muttered, his voice trembling, though he wasn't sure if it was for the man or for himself. His hands hovered, unsure, unwilling to touch the life he had just shattered. The driver's breathing grew faint, but his gaze never broke. Even as his body weakened, his eyes held on, anchoring the truth the officer couldn't escape. No cover story, no excuse, could erase that look. And then came the worst sound of all, the crackle of his own radio. Static filled the air, a dispatcher's voice calling out into the night. His stomach lurched. He knew he had to respond, but his mouth went dry. If he said nothing, suspicion would come. If he spoke, the weight of his lie would begin. Panic clawed at his chest, sweat running cold down his temples. He swallowed hard, finally pressing the button. His voice came out strained, shaking. "Shots fired. Suspect resisted. Officer needs backup." The words were lifeless, forced, already poisoned by the truth they tried to bury. As the radio echoed back his call, the silence of the street swallowed the rest. The driver lay still, the life bleeding out of him, and the officer stood over him, consumed by the irreversible. The crime had unfolded in seconds, but the echoes of it would stretch far beyond that night, carrying with them the weight of pride, fear, and a single word that changed everything. No. The crime left a silence that was louder than any scream. For those closest to it, reality seemed to fracture the moment the act was committed. Family members of both the victim and the perpetrator were caught in a haze of shock, denial, and disbelief. Some refused to accept what had happened, speaking of the Vics, Tim as though they would walk through the door again. Others lashed out in anger, unable to comprehend how someone they trusted could commit such an act. The perpetrator, meanwhile, clung to rationalizations in the immediate aftermath. They whispered to themselves that it had been necessary, that they were provoked, that circumstances had left them no other choice. Yet beneath those fragile excuses, guilt already began to take root, spreading quietly in their subconscious like a slow, choking vine. In the days that followed, coping mechanisms varied wildly. The perpetrator struggled with sleepless nights filled with nightmares and intrusive thoughts. They grew paranoid, convinced every hushed conversation or sideways glance was a sign that someone knew the truth. Their hands shook at the smallest sound. Their heart raced whenever the phone rang, and the simple act of looking in a mirror became unbearable. Close accomplices or enablers, those who had overlooked troubling behavior or helped cover small lies before the crime, were torn apart internally. Some doubled down on loyalty, weaving alibis and half-truths to protect the perpetrator, while others quietly distanced themselves, sickened by the role they had played. For the victim's loved ones, grief twisted into a storm of sorrow and rage. They demanded answers that would never satisfy them, searching desperately for someone to blame, even as they blamed themselves for not recognizing warning signs. Families fractured under the weight of loss. Siblings argued, parents withdrew, marriages strained until they broke. The community, too, could not escape the ripple effects. Neighbors who once gathered casually over fences now avoided eye contact. Conversations that had once been filled with laughter turned dark and suspicious, every sentence trailing off into speculation. Fear settled over the streets like a thick fog. Parents who had always felt safe letting their children roam freely now kept them close, clutching their hands as though danger lurked around every corner. Familiar landmarks became tainted with memory. The house where it happened was no longer a home, but a haunted shell. The police tape left fluttering in the wind became a constant reminder that something had been shattered. Even the smallest details, the scent of bleach in the air, the mark on the floor that would never quite wash away, served as wounds that refused to heal. As expected, the media descended swiftly, transforming a tragedy into a spectacle. Reporters crowded outside homes, shoved microphones at grieving relatives, and sensationalized even the smallest detail. News anchors painted the crime in stark colors, good and evil, victim and villain, simplifying complexities into digestible narratives. The perpetrator, once perhaps respected as a family member, a friend or a neighbor, was recast overnight as a monster, their reputation obliterated. Old photographs of them smiling were now plastered alongside headlines that screamed of betrayal and violence. The victim, on the other hand, was placed on a pedestal by some and remembered as innocent and blameless. Yet in darker corners of media discourse, whispers emerged blaming the victim, spinning cruel narratives that suggested they had somehow invited tragedy upon themselves. The internet made everything worse, with strangers dissecting rumors, inventing theories, and turning private grief into public entertainment. Legal consequences arrived in the form of interrogations, hearings, and eventually a trial. The justice system, slow and relentless, forced families to relive the crime again and again. Every testimony reopened wounds. Every piece of evidence reminded them of what had been lost. The perpetrator tried at times to grasp at loopholes or to twist events in their favor, but the evidence was damning, and the weight of their own guilt became impossible to ignore. Institutions tied to the individuals, the schools their children attended, the workplace they had once served, even the church pew they had occupied, were all scrutinized. People demanded to know why warning signs had gone unnoticed. How had jealousy, obsession, or desperation been allowed to fester unchecked? For the individuals themselves, the emotional fallout was devastating. The perpetrator, once proud or composed, began to unravel. Haunted by visions of the crime, they became gaunt, withdrawn, and unrecognizable even to those who had loved them. In private, some whispered confessions through tears, desperate to rid themselves of the burden, while in public they clung stubbornly to denial. Their family carried a different kind of torment, the shame of being tied by blood to someone society now condemned. Neighbors stared at them with contempt, whispers followed them down grocery aisles, and children who once played freely were mocked at school. For the victim's family, the pain never lessened. It reshaped their lives entirely. Some sought solace in therapy, vigils, or advocacy, trying to ensure no one else endured what they had. Others collapsed into despair, numbing themselves with alcohol or drugs, abandoning careers, or withdrawing entirely from the world. Relationships buckled under the strain, and what remained was a landscape of broken connections. The crime reverberated beyond individual families. It became a symbol, a case study for larger societal flaws. Mental health neglect was one glaring issue. Signs of breakdown and obsession had been evident, but dismissed as trivial until it was too late. Financial struggles, reputational pressures, and rigid societal expectations were also revealed as hidden forces that had pushed tensions toward breaking point. Institutions that might have intervened, whether law enforcement, schools, or community organizations, were criticized for their failure to act. What had once seemed like an isolated tragedy now stood as proof of cracks in the wider social fabric. In time, the chaos quieted, but silence did not mean healing. The perpetrator faced their fate, whether incarceration, public disgrace, or eventual psychological collapse. Their name became a cautionary tale, forever tied to violence and betrayal. The victim's absence remained an open wound, an emptiness at dinner tables and family gatherings that no passage of time could fill. The community learned to move forward, but shadows lingered in the corners of memory, and people walked with a little more fear in their steps. Justice, when it came, felt incomplete. A guilty verdict could not bring back a life, nor could it erase the trauma inflicted on those left behind. The law offered punishment, but not closure. In quiet moments when cameras were gone and reporters had turned to fresher scandals, those who had lived through it were left alone with their grief. The story lived on, not in headlines, but in the whispered memories of those forever changed. The story did not end in the courtroom, even though many thought it would. The sentencing, the public statements, the images of the perpetrator being led away in chains, these moments offered a sense of closure for some. But for those who had lived through the crime, it was only another chapter in a book they had never wanted to open. The perpetrator, once a person with authority and power, was now stripped of every title, every privilege, and every ounce of respect. Prison became their world, a place where silence was pierced by the constant sound of metal doors slamming shut. They learned quickly that inside they were not feared or respected, only pitied or despised. In their loneliness, they replayed the night of the crime over and over, the details looping endlessly like a film they could not stop. No excuse, no justification could silence the truth of what they had done. Justice had been served by the law, but it was not the kind of justice that healed wounds. It was the kind that left scars. For the victim's family, the legal verdict was a hollow comfort. Hearing the word guilty did not fill the empty chair at the dinner table, nor did it stop the tears that came late at night. Their lives were irrevocably changed, not by the outcome of the trial, but by the absence of someone they loved. They lived in a constant tug-of-war between anger and grief. At times, they found themselves questioning whether true justice could ever exist. What punishment could balance out the life that had been taken? Some turned toward faith, seeking meaning in something larger than themselves. Others turned inward, letting silence carry the weight of what words could not. Each member of the family carried their pain differently, but all of them were bound together by a loss that would never fade. The community struggled with its own reckoning. The case had become a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about power and prejudice. People whispered in grocery stores, debated in town meetings, and filled the comment sections of online articles with heated opinions. Some argued that the crime was the tragic result of one person's flaws, while others saw it as evidence of something far deeper, systemic issues that had long gone unchallenged. Neighbors who once avoided such conversations now spoke openly about race, authority, and the imbalance of power. It was not always comfortable, and it often led to arguments, but silence was no longer an option. The community had been forced to confront the reality that injustice was not something that only happened in faraway cities or in the pages of history books. It had happened on their own streets, at their own doorstep. The media moved on, as it always does, but the internet ensured the story never truly disappeared. Years after the trial, articles resurfaced, documentaries were made, and strangers on social media argued about details as though they had lived them. For the families involved, this constant resurfacing was like a wound being reopened. They could not move forward fully because society would not let the story rest. Yet, strangely, the story's persistence also served as a reminder. What happened here mattered, not only to those who lived it, but to everyone watching from the outside. It became a cautionary tale, a symbol of how unchecked prejudice and abuse of power could destroy lives. As time passed, people began to reflect on the broader themes. Power dynamics had been at the center of it all. The perpetrator, blinded by authority, had acted with arrogance, believing they were untouchable. The victim, targeted because of who they were rather than anything they had done, had become a symbol of vulnerability. In a world where bias still dictated too much, the crime forced society to ask hard questions. How much power should any one person hold? How do we prevent authority from turning into abuse? And most importantly, what does justice truly mean when so much damage has already been done? Morality, too, became a lingering question. Some saw the perpetrator as a monster, a person defined entirely by the crime they committed. Others, though, looked deeper and saw a human being undone by their own flaws, jealousy, fear, prejudice, and the inability to confront their own weaknesses. Was it enough to condemn them without also examining the conditions that had shaped them? Could acknowledging their humanity coexist with demanding accountability for their actions? These were not easy questions, but they were the ones that stayed long after the cameras left and the trials ended. For the families, the story became less about justice and more about survival. They learned to live with grief, to build lives around a hole that could never be filled. They carried the memory of what was lost and tried, in their own ways, to make sense of it. For the victim's family, survival meant honoring their loved one, refusing to let them be reduced to a headline. For the perpetrator's family, survival meant living with shame, learning to separate themselves from what had been done, and struggling with the painful truth that love for a family member could exist even alongside condemnation of their actions. In the end, the crime became more than just a tragedy between two people. It became a lens through which society could see itself, flawed, divided, and still struggling to reconcile ideals of justice with the messy reality of human behavior. It showed how prejudice, unchecked, could erupt into violence. It showed how power, abused, could ruin not only one life, but many. And it showed how communities, though shaken, could be forced into the difficult work of reflection and change. The story lingers because it is not just about one night, or one crime, or one trial. It is about the fragile nature of justice, the complexities of morality, and the truths about human nature that most prefer to ignore. It is about how quickly the lines between right and wrong blur when fear, anger, and power are at play. And it is about how, in the end, every decision, every abuse of authority, every silence in the face of wrongdoing, every act of prejudice, leaves a mark that ripples outward, changing more lives than we can ever measure. The outcome left no winners. A life was lost, another destroyed, families shattered, and a community forced to reckon with wounds that would not heal. Yet in the ashes of what was left, there was also the faint hope that by confronting the ugliness of what had happened, people might learn. They might build systems that hold authority accountable. They might teach their children differently. They might look in the mirror and question their own biases before those biases harden into something more dangerous. The story ended in tragedy, but its echoes carried the possibility of change.